Right, welcome everybody to this seminar, which is jointly sponsored by the Education Employers Task Force and the Centre for Education and Industry at the University of Warwick. So we're particularly pleased that our speaker today is the head of the Centre for Education and Industry at Warwick University. Julian Stanley has worked in issues surrounding sort of vocational education in multiple roles for some time. He's been engaged in a particularly interesting sort of comparative project on vocational education. And Julian, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Good afternoon, everyone. So I think it's, I'm not sure that at the Task Force seminars that we've kind of done stuff before on vocational education, or indeed on comparative education. So it's you know, kind of a bit new, I think. It's sort of stretching out a little bit. But I do think, as Anthony says, that vocational education is very much an issue at the moment in the UK. And I do think there are good opportunities for learning from comparison. Not always easy to do that, but I think it's worth sort of trying to do. And at the end, I might sort of try and come back to that a little bit and sort of, you know, explore a little bit an alternative and whether that's a viable alternative for us. In general, this is what's called part of a transversal programme from DG Education and Culture. It lasted from 2009-2012, and it was about 7 EU countries, which England, Germany, Slovenia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Greece. It's a large-scale survey, and one of the sort of characteristics about it was to do a big survey. And there were 18,000 young people involved in it, of whom 10,000 were in the kind of key age range, which is 17 to 18. And they're all doing vocational programs. So the idea is to try and get a view about what the perceptions of these young people are, and to be able to make comparisons between different groups and try and have a bit of a feeling about how they're seeing the vocational education that they're getting. Objectives, as I say, to investigate the perceptions, to provide data for researchers. It was commissioned by Eurydice, which is the kind of information service of the EU, and to inform policy development and research in the EU. Okay, there's a little bit of a hypothetical model here about what's going on, which I won't say a great deal about, but it's the idea about how success in vocational education is influenced by a number of factors here. The pedagogy, the social demographic characteristics, and the nature of the systems. There's more of that in the report. I'm not going to kind of go into that. That's a sort of attempt at sort of theoretical model building which is going on, which is part of this research. What are the areas of focus? Well, motivation and satisfaction is a key area. We've also got their transition and choice, teaching and learning modes, school success, and competencies. This business about competencies is very important in the kind of European discourse. There's a big emphasis not only on how sort of well people are achieving, but on particularly what knowledge and skills they're gaining. Because a lot of the discussion there is about, we're not very interested in just how well they're achieving. What we're interested in is have they got the skills and knowledge they need to fill the jobs which Europe has got. So there's an attempt to try and get into that and look at the particular competencies or outcomes which are coming out of these processes. Career aspirations, ICT, and interest in international study. So some of the challenges for the research were trying to come up with a research instrument that made sense across Europe, having a sampling method that worked in these different countries, trying to understand the different systems so that we can make sense of people's responses. There were interviews and qualitative work as well as quantitative work, and building a kind of critical model for understanding it all. So those are the sort of challenges of the work. In England, the University of Warwick was involved in kind of design and interpretation. We didn't actually collect the data. That was done by CFE, which is a research agency. And they used the cluster method. In other words, they selected 35 random institutions, and then within that they managed to recruit 1,000 participants. And the breakdown was sort of 600 or so in 16 to 19 colleges, around 300 in training providers, and about 70 in sixth form. So it's not a bad kind of spread across for sort of 17 to 18-year-olds studying vocational programs in England. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to explore with you a little bit some findings. It's only kind of, just giving you a bit of a feeling, really. I'm afraid you'll have to read the report if you want to get the whole thing. And what is quite good about this project is all the data is on the website. So, you know, you don't have to believe me. You can look at the data, you can do your analysis, and it's all set up so you can analyze it yourselves. So it's very much a kind of open project in that way. Anyway, this is just sort of starting off by looking at perceptions of vocational education. And I think one of the interesting things here is about the way that VET is perceived and valued in different countries is quite variable. We find, for example, in Germany and Austria and Slovenia, relatively high valuation of VET. It's perceived as having a positive image. Citizens perceive it offers high quality learning. And that kind of corresponds to relatively high participation in VET. So a big proportion of the cohort are doing it, and it's well perceived. What we find in Latvia, Lithuania, Greece, and UK is that's not the case. I mean, there isn't a sort of match between the sort of level of people doing it and the perception. I mean, in UK, for example, the perception of VET is actually not bad. I mean, it's quite reasonable, but the proportion, the cohort actually involved in it is much lower. So there's a bit of a gap between sort of how people say they value it and the extent to which they're participating in it. So that sort of raises some questions about what's going on there, you know, why they might be valuing it but not actually participating in it. It's not a problem I've got an answer to, but it's a bit of a sort of problem about understanding VET across these countries. If we look a little bit about the kinds of programs that people are doing, I think one of the striking things about the UK generally, actually that should say England, not the UK, because these are English figures, is that we find in England, for 17 to 18-year-olds, a much higher proportion of courses are only 1 year or 2 year courses. So it's a characteristic of VET in the UK that there's a higher proportion of shorter courses. And it's also a characteristic that those shorter courses tend to be at lower levels. Indeed, you know, for some people in Europe, they're very puzzled as to why we have such large numbers of people doing level 2 programs when, you know, they're hardly, you know, in Germany and Austria, well, Germany in particular, they're not doing very many level 2 courses at all. They're getting people onto longer programs which move right the way through to a level 3 program. So, you know, one of the issues around why VET programs in this country may not have the value in the labour market, which has been Alison Wolf's big sort of attack, you know, it may be associated with the fact that these are relatively short courses at relatively low levels. Okay. So now we're getting into some of the sort of responses of people. And this is about programme choice. And what we see here is that in terms of sort of job prospects, the kind of UK respondents, the English respondents are kind of rating things similarly as we across the sort of the best performers, Austria and Germany, but far less so when in terms of talking about a good foundation. This one here, good foundation for further education and qualifications. So it seems to be that in terms of the way that these programs permit you to go on and do sort of higher level vocational programs, that the rating isn't quite so strong. The other thing which is interesting here is about the influence of teachers. I mean, the influence of teachers is kind of relatively strong, and the influence of geography is relatively strong in England. These seem to be quite important choice factors determining courses, stronger than they are in quite a lot of other countries. You know, that's sort of a difference there. In terms of information sources, okay, so teachers appear to be relatively important in England, you know, far more important than any of the other countries which we're comparing ourselves with here. Information days in schools are kind of relatively unimportant. School counsellors relatively important, and I think this is interesting here. I mean, the performance for England is kind of similar to a lot of other countries, but in Germany, for example, you find that these early internships that they have during secondary school are far more important in influencing choice of vocational programs. And they do have these quite extended work experience, what we would call work experience in Germany. Not just one for 2 weeks, but they have a number of them over the sort of the end of their upper school. And these are quite informative. And not only are they quite informative, but quite often people go in, they convert them into an apprenticeship. You know, they start off doing a work experience there, and then subsequently that is converted into an apprenticeship at the same enterprise. So, you know, this is, probably one of the factors which enables people to make, have well-informed choices, so they're getting onto the right vet program, which we haven't got. This is just exploring a little bit further the value of information days in particular. And I think the striking thing here is that the information days are kind of relatively valued by people doing the higher level courses, the two-year, the longer programs. I won't dwell on that too much. Here, another thing about kind of comparing the impact of peer influence. And I think it's sort of interesting how influential peers are, friends are, in England, particularly for the lower level courses. So the kind of implication there is that we have these short one-year programs, quite general programs, and people in choosing them are 30% or so are being influenced by what their peers say, what their friends say, rather than other sources of information about whether it's the right program for them, whether it's going to lead them where they're going. So probably not all that advanced thinking about careers and vocations at that stage. And again, kind of confirming this a little bit, to what extent are learners exploring alternatives? Well, we find in England that only 12% of students look at more than one alternative when making a choice. So they're just not exploring a lot of alternatives when deciding what program they're going to do. It's not a very extensive choice which is going on. Now that, of course, may be because they've absolutely made up their minds. But given that quite a lot of them are doing these quite low-level, quite general courses, that may not be the case. Indeed, we've probably got these low-level, general, short courses because people haven't made up their minds. So it raises the question about, if we're going to change those courses, and that's what's proposed that we're doing, that we have less of these general short courses, then what are going to be the processes prior to that which is going to lead to good information so they can take bigger courses, higher level courses, because previously they've been doing these short lower level courses because they just didn't know what else to do. They didn't know what direction they were committed to. So that's just the sort of same data pointing out that 51% of English students didn't consider any alternatives at all when they made their choices. And we've also got this figure here that 30% of English vet students say that they're uncertain that they're on the right course, or they believe they're not on the right course. So that's an indication that, choosing to do a course in that way is not always leading to satisfaction. You've got a substantial minority who are doubtful about whether they're on the right program or not. Okay? Okay. This was just looking at how many hours of vocational schooling they're getting, and you can see that that actually the number of hours that people are getting is relatively low. Now that may be linked to the sort of some of these funding issues about sort of pushing people through courses in order to get as much funding as you can. But there's an indication that people are actually getting less hours of education there, so that may be an issue about in terms of outcomes. And this is beginning to look a little bit at the relationship between grades and motivation. And I think this is one of the kind of biggest findings of this research. And basically the finding is that high levels of motivation are associated with high performance. Now that may seem to you to be pretty banal, but I guess sometimes what's important is to find empirically confirm what we kind of know intuitively is going to be the case. Okay, and this is strongly confirmed across these countries that there is this relationship. And I'm afraid I think that the grey boxes which indicate where the statistically significant relationships have for some reason not managed to find their way across from one version of PowerPoint to another. But I can tell you, from my version, there's a lot of grayed-in boxes there indicating there's a lot of statistically significant relationships. Okay, so we find that, in particular these ones here which have been picked out here, that that people who strive for the highest possible marks, or they're strongly committed to being fully understanding what they're trying to learn. In other words, whether they've got a kind of intrinsic or an instrumental motivation, in both cases, this is highly related to stronger levels of performance. So it suggests that, working at motivation is going to be associated with high performance. Of course, the causality may be the other way around. Okay, but there's a strong connection between those two things. This is looking for the extent to which people are in paid employment outside of their courses. And we generally think of students in England as being highly involved in the labour market during their education. And that is indeed the case generally, okay? But we find actually, slightly surprisingly, that English students are far less likely to be involved in holiday work. Whereas the pattern in a lot of Europe is that students don't do work during the course of their studies, but they do holiday work. And putting those two things together, it turns out that England isn't actually, the levels of participation in the labour market are not actually particularly high in England overall. Okay, so it's interesting, and it raises the question about whether perhaps experience of the labour market could be done more in holiday time in England, as it appears to be done in Europe, without competing with study time. Okay, so this here is looking at how people rate their teachers and their learning experiences in relationship to their grades. Okay, and what we discover here is that basically, where there's a high level of satisfaction, where people are finding their classes interesting, or where they're judging their teachers well prepared, or where they're perceiving their teachers as being giving them individual support, then levels of achievement are highest. Okay, so there's a strong correlation between satisfaction with the quality of teaching and the volume of teaching and performance, achievement. So it's suggesting that these are the instruments, these are the levers, that quality of teaching, individual attention, these are the kind of things which are associated with high levels of achievement. Overall satisfaction, all in all, I'm satisfied with the programme, you see is relatively high in England. Okay, clearly it's higher where people are achieving more highly, so it's strongly correlated to high performance, but nevertheless it's relatively high in England. So I think it's important to remember that when we have criticisms of vet qualifications in England, they're perceived as having low value in the labour market, that they may nevertheless have high value for learners. Okay, and we need to be aware that a kind of an objective measure of low returns in the labour market, that may be a little bit of a different measure of how learners are perceiving them and what learners are gaining from them. Because this is about learner voice and about learner perceptions as opposed to sort of labour market valuations. This is a question here about whether people would choose to do the same programme again. And you can see, you can see that actually there's a relatively large proportion of people who would choose to do the same program again, although it is higher for those students who are on high grades rather than low grades. This is about sort of plans to continue. Do you plan to continue schooling? And again, similar sort of pattern across the whole of Europe, really, that the students with high grades have got a greater commitment to carrying on with their studies. So I suppose that sort of 38%, which have got, low grades, which are planning. I mean, our concern, I suppose, is therefore about the sort of 62% who have got low grades and who are not planning to carry on. And this is just sort of pulling these data out a little bit more closely. So, I mean, the English students, the general plan to continue education is relatively strong in comparison with European averages. I think what perhaps is particularly striking is the relatively large percentage who are seeking to carry on at higher education. And I suppose that confirms with what we know about the English system, that there's a strong predisposition to try and go into higher education. But I suppose it's interesting here to see that the aspiration to go on into higher vocational programs is although around average, it's lower than a country like Germany, where there's a greater emphasis upon proceeding not to university, but into higher vocational programs. And this one here is looking at the relationship between grades and aspirations towards further education. And again, I mean, it's just sort of drawing out a little bit more closely that the aspirations for further education are kind of related to achieving high grades. This was exploring the aspirations for the experience of international programs, and the picture in the UK is that there's very, very little participation in international study programs. Vocational students are just not really doing this. It's much lower than in most of the other countries in Europe. The qualitative research we did, talking to people, talking to students and talking to teachers, said there was an aspiration, there was a perception that vocational programs needed to be made more European, that people needed to be addressing opportunities for working in Europe and for learning in Europe and so on, but they just didn't, it wasn't happening. So that appears to be a sort of a deficiency which needs to be addressed, I guess. Now, I was going to sort of, if I've got time, just do a little bit of a sort of case study. So that's just some sort of general stuff about the survey overall, and I just wanted just to have a little bit look of one country, because included within this research was exploration of what was going on in the 7 countries. And one of the notions is that you might be able to look at one of these countries and see sort of a possible model for where your country might learn from or where it might be heading. And I thought we'd just have a little look at Austria today. And the reason for looking at Austria is that Austria has got these technical vocational schools which are specialist, high quality, high status technical schools. So they're a little bit like UTCs. And moreover, they've been much invested in the last sort of 20 years or so, or less than that probably, 15 years. They've been seen as a way forward, they've been heavily invested in, they've been built up, and they're a big success story. They've taken a much bigger share of the population. So they kind of represent a sort of experiment of building a sort of high quality technical education institution and trying to use that to boost sort of performance in VET. So let's just have a little look at Austria. So in Austria, 75% of the cohort are doing VET programs. So it's an amazingly high participation in VET, where it's only 40% in England. Okay, youth unemployment is miraculously low. It's only 8.6%. And they've got these vocational high schools, berufsbildende Höherschulen, which have had this big increase in their share of the cohort. Okay, so up from 10% to 23% since 1980. So they've kind of done it. I mean, they have managed to do, what Lord Baker would like us to do. Okay. So let's just have a little look at how things sort of shape up in Austria. So these vocational high schools, they're for 14 to 19-year-olds. It's a 5-year program. They've got 23% of the cohort, and it's an expensive program. Okay, it isn't cheap. Okay, 45,000 euros per head. Okay, so it's an expensive program. So there's an investment, there's a willingness to invest in high quality programs. Okay, and as a result of that, these are much sought after. I mean, these are desirable programs which are much contested and fought to get people's children into. Then you've got the kind of, standard vocational schools, which, the problem with these, of course, is that they've been sort of pressed a bit by the success of these. So these are perceived as kind of lower status in comparison to these ones. It's a shorter program, they've got 12% of the cohort, and there's less investment in it. Then you've got the kind of much vaunted dual apprenticeship. Okay, so this is only 400 hours in school per year, and the rest of the time you're in an enterprise. 40% of the cohort. Much cheaper, because a lot of the time they're in the enterprise, but of course it is of lower status. It is perceived to be of lower status. It is perceived as being an inferior program. And then, of course, you've got the grammar schools, 20%, an elite program, actually cheaper than the technical high schools. Now, the vocational high schools, which are the most interesting sort of beast here, they do combine a general and a vocational curriculum. They do a dual qualification, and I think that's very important. They do the Matura, which is the equivalent of A-levels, it's a baccalaureate, and they gain a professional qualification. So they're gaining both of these things, and this is a critical feature, I think, of their success, is they do give admission into university, because you get the Matura, which is what you need to go to university. The scope for specialisation, because there are specialised technical high schools which specialize in business or in engineering, but also over the program, in the second 2 years, you can do further specialization. So there's quite a lot of opportunities for specialization. And I think it's important to be aware that this is one of the things which contribute to the high status. So the fact that you can specialize and get a kind of occupational specialism out of it is a way of enhancing its status and its value. They've got very strong industry links. Schools can modify a large part of the curriculum to meet the needs of their enterprise partners, and assessment is closely linked to enterprises. You have assessment projects which are set by enterprises. Very extensive employer engagement and compulsory summer work experience. Okay, you get in, you have to do it, you have to do the work experience, you're linked into the enterprise. So it's very, very strong industrial linkage. However, what is it doing for social mobility? What is it doing for social mobility? Well, what we find is a bit disappointing. Because if you look at the percentage of parents of students who are going to these schools, you find that 60% of them have already got to mature. So the trouble is that these schools, which are high status, which are a passport into into professional careers, and also a passport into higher education, are recognized as being a powerful way in, a powerful way up, and therefore parents with mature, parents who already got a high level of qualifications are capturing a sort of disproportionate share of that. And we can see that if we compare that to the other vocational routes. So I suppose the challenge here is, if you follow a route by which you have a high quality institution with high success rate, with high value qualifications, how do you simultaneously achieve social mobility? How do you ensure that that remains accessible to everyone? Okay, I'm going to wind up now. So www.7eu.vet, that's the website. If you go there, you can access the reports, you can access the data, and you can carry out the analysis yourselves. Thank you very much.